Friends, thank you for being here. What we are witnessing right now is not a minor hiccup in American trade. It is a collapse that is devastating the very farmers who were promised salvation. Donald Trump swore that his tariffs would protect American agriculture. He looked farmers in the eye and said he would shield them from foreign competition. But today, those very policies have unleashed the opposite. A crisis so deep that the $30 billion U.S. milk market is on the brink of implosion. Barns are closing, farmers are drowning in losses, global buyers who once depended on American dairy are walking away. And who is stepping in to seize those buyers? Canada and Mexico, the very neighbors Trump claimed he could bully with ease. This isn't just about trade deals on paper. It's about the collapse of rural livelihoods, about families who spent generations on dairy farms now being forced to sell their land for pennies. And it's about ordinary Americans who are about to pay higher prices at the grocery store while watching their nation's farmers sink into bankruptcy. Trump's tariffs didn't protect American farmers. They betrayed them. They turned the breadbasket into a graveyard of broken promises. But the bigger question remains, if America can't even sell its milk, the most basic, everyday staple, what does that mean for its claim to lead global trade? When Donald Trump launched his trade wars, he declared them easy to win. He told farmers that tariffs would be their shield, that foreign nations would cave under pressure, and that American agriculture would finally get the respect it deserved. It was a performance, a show staged for rallies and headlines. But behind the slogans, the reality was very different. Instead of surrendering, U.S. trading partners retaliated. And who were among the first to push back? Canada and Mexico, America's two biggest dairy customers. These neighbors, far from being intimidated, saw Trump's tariffs as an insult. They weren't going to roll over. They responded in kind, slapping tariffs of their own on U.S. dairy exports. And almost overnight, the American dairy farmer, the very group Trump claimed to protect, became collateral damage in a trade war they never asked for. The arrogance of Trump's gamble was breathtaking. He believed that decades of carefully built trade relationships could be ripped up without consequence. He assumed that Canada and Mexico had no alternatives. But markets don't wait for political speeches. Buyers shifted, suppliers stepped in, and America's farmers were left standing in the wreckage. Think about the betrayal here. Trump waved the flag of America first. But what it delivered was farmers last, scrambling to survive, while the rest of the world adapted and moved on. His tariffs didn't punish foreign nations. They punished the very people who trusted him most. And here's the deeper irony. By trying to play hardball with America's neighbors, Trump didn't just disrupt trade, he dismantled trust. Canada and Mexico, once reliable partners for American dairy, began asking themselves why they should ever depend on a supplier whose leader was willing to turn them into enemies at a moment's notice. This is how the trap was set. Promises of protection, followed by retaliation, followed by collapse. A trade war that was easy to win became a war American farmers could never afford to fight. To understand the scale of this collapse, we need to talk about the size of America's dairy industry. It isn't just a niche sector. It is one of the most critical arms of U.S. agriculture, a $30 billion market built on exports as much as domestic sales. For decades, America's dairy farmers relied on two steady buyers right across the border, Canada and Mexico. Year after year, they absorbed huge volumes of American milk, cheese, and dairy products. That relationship kept barns running, kept farmers solvent, and kept rural communities alive. But when Trump unleashed his tariffs, that lifeline was severed. Canada and Mexico, tired of being targets in his trade war, walked away. They didn't just cut orders. They redirected their purchasing power to Europe, to South America, and to their own domestic industries. The signal was loud and clear. They no longer needed the U.S. The consequences are staggering. Imagine being a farmer in Wisconsin or Minnesota, producing milk at record levels, only to see the biggest customers slam the door. The tankers are still full. The cows still need milking, but the buyers are gone. Instead of steady export revenue, farmers face collapsing demand and plunging prices. And here's the cruel irony. The American dairy system was built for scale. Farms invested in bigger herds, bigger facilities, and more production under the assumption that global demand would always be there. Trump's tariffs destroyed that assumption in a single stroke. Suddenly, the market that justified all those investments vanished. What's left behind are mountains of unsold milk, barns running at a loss, and families drowning in debt. This is not just numbers on a spreadsheet. It's real lives being crushed. Generations of farmers who built their livelihoods on cross-border trade are now staring at bankruptcy papers. Entire communities in America's heartland are watching their economic backbone crumble. And the symbolism cannot be ignored. Canada and Mexico didn't just reject U.S. milk. They rejected the illusion of American dominance. They proved that even the most basic, everyday commodity, milk, could be used to humble the world's supposed superpower. When Canada and Mexico walked away, they didn't just punish Trump. They shattered the backbone of U.S. farming. That's the reality of this $30 billion collapse. What makes this collapse even more devastating is the way it unfolded. Trump told farmers his tariffs were a weapon to protect them, but in reality, they became a weapon aimed straight at their livelihoods. Here's how the backfire worked. Farmers, believing Trump's promises, kept expanding production. They bought more cows, grew more feed, built bigger barns, and poured money into their operations, expecting that tariffs would mean stronger domestic markets and higher prices. Instead, the opposite happened. The very neighbors who once bought America's surplus walked away, leaving farmers drowning in milk they couldn't sell. Prices at the farm level plummeted. What once brought a living wage now barely covers costs. Farmers can't even afford to keep the lights on in their barns. Desperation is everywhere. Some are dumping milk into fields or sewers because there's no buyer. Others are shutting down after generations, watching a family legacy vanish because of one man's reckless gamble. And where was Washington when this crisis hit? Scrambling to hand out subsidies, Band-Aid payments that might cover a fraction of the losses but do nothing to solve the underlying problem. The government effectively told farmers, "We broke your market, here's a check, now be quiet." But farmers can't cash that check and rebuild trust with lost buyers. They can't buy back the contracts that Canada and Mexico are now giving to European suppliers. Once those markets are gone, they're gone for good. The truth is unavoidable. Trump's tariffs backfired. They didn't force Canada or Mexico to bend the knee. They didn't make America stronger. They gutted the very industry he swore to protect. Think about the scale of betrayal here. These are not just statistics. They're families who woke up every morning before dawn, who worked 12-hour days in the barns, who trusted that their government wouldn't deliberately sabotage them. And yet, that's exactly what happened. Trump bragged about being the farmers' champion. He promised to fight for them. But what he delivered was bankruptcy, humiliation, and despair. His tariffs didn't protect America's dairy farmers. They pushed them into the abyss. When we talk about America's dairy collapse, it's easy to get lost in the billions. $30 billion in lost markets, billions in subsidies, billions in foreign contracts now gone. But behind those numbers are farmers, real people, families, communities, and their stories are devastating. Across Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan, and upstate New York, barns that once bustled with life now stand eerily quiet. Generations of farmers who carried their family name proudly through decades of work are being forced to sell their herds, auction their equipment, and close their doors. In some cases, the land itself, passed down for a century or more, is being lost to foreclosure. Dairy farming is not just a job, it's an identity, a way of life, and it's vanishing. Farmers describe the same painful reality. Milk prices so low they can't cover feed costs, banks refusing to extend credit, and a mountain of unsold product piling up with nowhere to go. Families are cutting corners on everything, from skipping veterinary care for their herds to pulling their kids out of college because tuition is impossible to afford. The emotional toll is crushing. Farmers who once took pride in producing America's milk now talk openly about despair, about the shame of losing land that their grandparents built, about the feeling of betrayal from a president who promised them the world and left them with nothing. Some are leaving agriculture altogether, forced into low-wage jobs far removed from the land they love. Others, tragically, see no way out at all. Rural communities are sounding alarms about rising mental health crises and farmer suicides, the human cost of Trump's failed gamble. And it's not just the farmers themselves. Entire communities are collapsing with them. Local feed stores, equipment suppliers, milk haulers, small-town diners all depend on the survival of dairy farms. When one farm goes under, dozens of other businesses feel the shock. Towns that once thrived on dairy money now see empty storefronts and shrinking populations. Meanwhile, Trump continues to claim he saved the farmers. He points to subsidies, to bailout checks, to temporary relief. But those checks can't buy back lost contracts with Canada and Mexico. They can't reopen barns that have already closed. They can't undo the humiliation of families losing everything while their president congratulates himself on television. This is the betrayal in its rawest form. Farmers believed Trump when he said, "I've got your back." They believed him when he said trade wars would be quick, painless, and profitable. Instead, they were sacrificed, their livelihoods destroyed, their futures ripped away. Barns are going dark across America's heartland. And it's not because farmers stopped working, it's because their president waged a war they never asked for, and left them to pick up the pieces. While American farmers collapse, the rest of the world is moving on, and fast. Canada and Mexico, once the biggest buyers of U.S. milk, didn't wait around to suffer under Trump's tariffs. They acted decisively. Canada doubled down on supporting its own dairy industry. With U.S. exports cut off, Canadian farmers stepped in to fill the gap, backed by subsidies and government policies designed to ensure domestic supply. For decades, Canada had been accused by Trump of unfair trade practices. But the irony is that those very protections now shield Canadian farmers from the chaos south of the border. While barns in Wisconsin close, barns in Ontario expand. While American farmers lose contracts, Canadian cooperatives win them. Mexico, on the other hand, looked outward. Locked out of affordable U.S. milk, Mexican buyers turned to Europe and South America. New trade deals were signed. Ships carrying milk powder, cheese, and dairy substitutes from the EU and Argentina now dock in Mexican ports. And here's the key: these aren't temporary fixes. Once buyers establish new supply chains, they rarely go back, which means even if U.S. farmers somehow recover, the buyers may already be gone for good. The result is simple. America's $30 billion dairy market is being carved up by its neighbors and rivals. Canada grows stronger at home. Mexico builds new relationships abroad. Europe and South America gain footholds they never dreamed possible. And America, once the unquestioned dairy superpower, is left behind. This is the classic story of Trump's trade wars. America loses, rivals win. The more he pushed, the more space he created for others to rise. He thought tariffs would force Canada and Mexico to submit. Instead, they used his blunder as an opportunity to cut ties and build a future without America. And here's the underdog twist that can't be ignored. Trump spent years ridiculing Canada and Mexico, treating them as junior partners who had no choice but to accept American dominance. Now those same neighbors are profiting from America's collapse, seizing markets that U.S. farmers built but can no longer hold. This isn't just a shift in trade. It's a shift in power. The U.S. once controlled the global dairy market. Today, it is Canada, Mexico, Europe, and South America that call the shots. And Trump handed them that power. Friends, let's step back for a moment, because this isn't just a story about milk. It is much larger than that. For decades, the United States carried itself as the agricultural superpower of the world, the breadbasket, the country that could feed not just its own people, but entire continents. And for a long time, that reputation was deserved. American exports, corn, soy, wheat, milk, were the lifeblood of global food markets. Buyers lined up, contracts were signed, and U.S. farmers enjoyed a status that gave Washington enormous leverage on the global stage. But today, that myth is crumbling. The milk market collapse is a flashing red light that exposes a deeper truth. America is no longer untouchable. Buyers have options. Canada and Mexico have proved that they can step in. Europe and South America are building new supply routes, and countries across Asia are learning an important lesson. They do not need America the way they once did. This is what makes the collapse of the U.S. dairy industry so profound. It shows that the global system has changed. Once, if America sneezed, the world caught a cold. Now, if America falters, the world simply moves on. And what is lost is not just money, not just trade contracts, but something far greater: credibility. The United States is discovering that when it comes to global markets, loyalty is a myth. Buyers go where the supply is stable, where the prices are competitive, where the politics are reliable. And under Trump's tariffs, America proved it could be none of those things. This is why the milk collapse is more than an agricultural issue. It's a symbol of U.S. decline in the global order. The fact that a $30 billion industry could be so easily fractured shows how fragile America's grip on trade really is. And if milk can fall, what's next? Corn, wheat, energy, technology? History teaches us that empires rarely collapse all at once. They unravel piece by piece, in sectors, in markets, in influence. What we are witnessing in the dairy collapse is one of those unravelings, a reminder that America's power is not permanent, not guaranteed, not unquestionable. Trump promised strength. He promised security. He promised a return to greatness. Instead, he exposed the weakness of the very foundation America stood on. He showed the world that U.S. markets can be abandoned as sea, and that when they are, others are ready to step in. This is the bigger meaning of the milk collapse. It is not about a glass of milk on the table. It is about the erosion of U.S. dominance in the world economy. Friends, let us be absolutely clear. This crisis did not fall from the sky. It was not a natural disaster, nor an unavoidable accident. It was manufactured by Donald Trump himself. He walked onto the stage promising to be the savior of America's farmers. He told them he alone understood their pain. He stood before cheering crowds in the Midwest and declared that trade wars were easy to win. But what he delivered was not victory. It was devastation. His tariffs were not a strategy. They were a gamble. A reckless move by a man more concerned with headlines than with consequences. He slapped duties on America's closest neighbors, thinking they would bow. Instead, they retaliated, and they hit where it hurt most: American agriculture. And then, when the damage became clear, what did Trump do? He threw taxpayer money at the problem, handing out subsidies like Band-Aids on a bullet wound. Farmers didn't need short-term checks. They needed stable markets. They needed secure buyers. They needed leadership. What they got instead was betrayal. Think about the cruel irony here. For generations, farmers built their lives on trust. Trust that hard work would provide, that their government would protect them, that America's reputation abroad would keep markets open. Trump shattered that trust in just a few years. He turned the Midwest, once the backbone of U.S. prosperity, into ground zero for bankruptcies and foreclosures. He stood before cameras and bragged about winning, while barns were shuttered, land was lost, and families were driven off farms that had survived for generations. This is not strength. This is not leadership. This is failure of the highest order. Trump's arrogance, his obsession with short-term optics, and his disdain for allies turned a $30 billion industry into rubble. He promised greatness and delivered ruin. And let us not forget, the world was watching. Buyers in Europe, Asia, and Latin America saw how unstable America had become under Trump. They saw how quickly one man's ego could throw entire industries into chaos. And they decided, never again. They would diversify. They would move on. They would not be held hostage by America's instability. That is Donald Trump's true legacy in this story. Not the savior of farmers, but the executioner of their future. Friends, what we have witnessed is nothing short of historic. $30 billion industry, the pride of American agriculture, brought to its knees. Not by foreign armies, not by natural disaster, but by the reckless hand of a president who promised protection and delivered collapse. Trump's tariffs were supposed to make America strong. Instead, they triggered retaliation from Canada and Mexico, the very neighbors who once bought more U.S. milk than anyone else. Those neighbors are now thriving, seizing the market America abandoned, while U.S. farmers drown in oversupply, bankruptcy, and despair. The consequences are everywhere. Families losing farms that had been passed down for generations. Barns once filled with life now standing silent. Consumers walking into supermarkets only to find prices rising, choices shrinking, and trust in America's stability fading. And on the global stage, buyers no longer line up at America's door. They have choices, and they are taking them. Europe, South America, Asia. The world is moving on. This is the larger truth. America is no longer untouchable. Trump exposed that weakness. He turned allies into competitors, neighbors into winners, and American farmers into casualties. The global order shifted, and it was Trump himself who pulled the trigger. Remember what he promised, that farmers would win again, that America would never bow, that trade wars were easy to win. What he delivered was the opposite. Farmers bankrupted, America isolated, trade wars lost before they even began. And the lesson is clear. Empires do not collapse all at once. They fall in pieces. First milk, then corn, then oil, then technology. Each collapse a symptom of the same disease, arrogance at the top, betrayal at the bottom. Friends, the story of America's milk collapse is not just about dairy. It is about the unraveling of U.S. credibility, the breaking of promises to the working class, and the rise of underdogs who were underestimated for far too long. Trump said America would be great again. But today, in the silent barns of the Midwest, in the rising supermarkets' bills, and in the booming dairy exports of Canada and Mexico, we see the truth. His policies buried the very farmers he promised to save. The final image is haunting. America, once the breadbasket of the world, reduced to begging for buyers while rivals cash in. Empty barns, broken families, soaring prices, shattered trust. And the question that remains for all of us is this: if America can no longer sell its food, the very foundation of its power, what happens when the next crisis comes? That is the legacy of Trump's tariffs. A legacy of collapse, humiliation, and decline,